Before I start with the latter part of the, of the second lecture, are there any questions from previous classes? Yes.
I was just wondering if you had any information for us for choosing essay topics.
Oh, good question. And somebody close the door, just make sure. So choosing essay topics. It has to be something that deals with social culture anthropology. In other words, if it deals with people who are alive today, or by extension with recent relatives of the people alive today, aka ethnic history, that is perfectly acceptable. So how do we find a topic? And it usually comes down to trying to find a balance with something that is too large, that would take so much time that a few PhD theses wouldn't be enough, to something so narrow that you can't find any sources for that particular topic, regardless of how much time you try to spend finding the information. So have you had the chance to read my information on how to use Google Scholar? And how do we use Google Scholar? It is a Boolean search. And what do we mean by a Boolean search? You put in words, eating and pork, and then we'll hit click, and you then specify. You might want, let's say, academic sources before 2020, after 2023. You might put in some more information. And what will happen then if I click in pork and eating in Google Scholar?
It will show you sources that say those words or
Exactly. It's like any other Google search. It's simply going through what it has, using its bots to find information, to find any articles that might be talking about both pork and eating. So let's say you have this fascination with the consumption of pork, but how do you make it anthropological when you're doing your Google search? Yep.
see what cultures eat pork.
Exactly. Or simply see what culture, or simply add and anthropology. And then what you will do that'll become more specific, it'll bring you, dredge up information, articles that are specifically either written by anthropologists or citing anthropologists or in anthropology journals. And this will at least help you cut down. So in other words, what you have to do is find something that interests you. Something that you have not necessarily written an essay about in another class, because that would be a form of self-plagiarism. But you find a topic that is of interest to you, whatever it may be. And generally speaking, it boils down to two things. Either A, a region of the world, or B, a specific topic. So you might want to say, I'm interested, I want to know more about the Johansi of Southern Africa. So what would you do then? Put in Johansi and San and Southern Africa, perhaps and South Africa and Namibia. So you put in the specific words and then add, of course, and anthropology. So this will help you quickly narrow down your sources. Or you find the topic. Let's say my topic is mortuary ritual in Russia. So I put mortuary ritual in Russia and anthropology. And hopefully you come up with one of my articles might pop out along with other authors who have studied this question. So this is a way to make sure that it'll be compatible with the course material. So if you can at least find 5 or 6 academic sources out of your 10 that will be written by anthropologists, then this is something that will classify as relevant to the material we're covering in this particular course. So it has to do with social cultural. So even though archaeology, paleoanthropology may fascinate me, the material must still deal with living people, or at least closely related recent living people that exist at this time on the planet. Now, once you have done that, the next step is trying to figure out, is this topic too broad? Is it too large? And how would you know that? How do you know if your topic is too broad? Yep.
Articles.
Exactly. So you might end up with 100,000 articles and you realize, oh, maybe I should find some way of narrowing it down. In other words, you have to start saying, okay, what more specific? So let's say if I were looking at the Johansi of Southern Africa, how can I narrow this down?
Picking a specific tribe?
Okay, perhaps a specific population, specific group. How else? You might say Johansi and, yes?
A specific aspect of that culture, or just like in general?
Exactly. So in the case of, let's say, the one of the chapters we'll be discussing today might be issues of and gender, and inequality, and and colonialism, and apartheid. So you'd be trying to find ways of coming down with something very specific. So what you have to do is not go the other direction. If your search becomes so specific that you end up with 5 articles, then you might say, okay, I'm a bit too tight in this, what I want to cover, and then you'll come back out. So it's this, you should be going back and forth. Looking at, you'll become too specific, then might become a bit too general. It's going back and forth until you reach that happy medium and say, yes, I'll be able to find, let's say, 50 potential sources. And out of those 50 potential sources, that all of them might be useful for my paper, I can at least narrow it down to 10. They'll be the best sources. They'll provide me enough information to write a brilliant paper on my topic. So this is the process by which you will go through the potential sources using, let's say, Google Scholar or any other information database we have through the library, and then narrowing it down to a topic that is manageable, that is doable for you. So I don't have a specific topic that say you must cover this, or these are the list of topics that you must cover. I give you some freedom, able to choose, but I do have the check, and since we're handing in the topics, at least I can say this topic is fun, would be great, but it's more appropriate for an archaeology course. Or I think you might have some challenges finding enough credible information and sources to write this topic. Or perhaps you'll get lost in the topic. Find a way to narrow it down. So these are the things which I'm hoping that you can work through as you slowly progress towards the final stages of writing the paper. Is that doable? Good. Any other questions? So last time we were talking about how colonialism and imperialism shaped anthropology. So I was mentioning the case of British anthropologists in Africa. How was it different from what we are seeing in North America, and especially in the United States with Boas? Yep. Exactly. In Africa, the goal wasn't, they didn't fear that there were cases of ethnocide and genocide where certain populations were wiped out, but for the most part, nobody expected or even wanted the major populations of Africa to disappear. So in other words, it wasn't a question of we want to do salvage anthropology. It was more, we know they're here, we know they're there, but the colonial regime is trying to bring about changes to facilitate our own industry, our own businesses, our own merchants. So the challenge there, and this is how it fits into the structural functionalism, is we don't want to keep it exactly as it is, because colonial regimes don't want to keep things exactly as they are, because they want production that can then be exported to the centers, to the metropolis, that can be reworked, and you will have then the population needing to buy goods back from the colonial center to thus create this capitalist loop going in and out. So you want to change certain things in order to facilitate your colonial goals, but at the same time you want to keep the population under control, and the British way was generally through indirect colonialism or indirect power. In other words, we work with certain populations that are already there, we give them certain privileges in exchange for us having really the control of the country. So you have this form of imperialism, and thus it fits into this idea of structural functionalism, which is we don't want the organism to have a heart attack, but if need be, we can do the heart transplant, or we can put in the pacemaker, or we can put in the stents to make sure that, that this patient will survive. So in other words, you want to have modifications, and you're looking from the perspective of each role, each part of society has its function and it has its role to play. And if to keep the entire organism healthy, aka not fall in complete anarchy, you must then look at how certain changes can be brought about to certain of the organs or certain of the other cells or parts of the body in order to keep the organism alive, though transformed to fit into your colonial model. And this was quite different from what we see with the imperialism that's happening in the United States, where there was an expansion in territory that was already seen not only to be controlled, but also to be overtaken by the colonial power. So in other words, the West was not simply to be ruled indirectly, it was to be populated by the settler colonial individual families that we wanted to be there. You want to take over the lands that are inhabited by people. So you have thus this idea that we will push into these lands, and then it was, what do we do with the people that are already living there? And if we look at this mindset, what were generally the outcomes? Yep.
They were forcing indigenous people off of their traditional land.
Exactly.
Forcing different work on them that they wanted to get done to bring back to it.
Exactly. So it was the relocation, and usually the relocation was preceded by warfare. So you have a whole set of, if we look even in the war that led to the end of New France, in the United States, it was known as the French and Indian Wars. And we have other periods where there were uprisings, there were wars, there was conflict. So it was very much an imperial expansion that was tied to the army, to armed forces. In the case, we see the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, being established as a means to militarily or quasi-militarily control the westward expansion. So there is this military expansion. Then you send in the military. Then you send out the surveyors. You send out the surveyors who will then chart out the land in order for it to be given, bought, sold to the settlers that will be there. And the expectation was, until even well into the 1920s and 1930s, was that the indigenous populations would simply disappear. So either the populations would disappear, or simply that, yes, the people, the descendants would be there, but their culture would be lost. So therefore, the role of Boaz and Singh was, we have to collect as much information as we can to ensure that the populations, this information, this knowledge, won't be lost forever. So it's much more of a salvage type of ethnography, saying we don't want to deal with big theory right now. We will simply try to do as much as we can to collect as much as we can while it's still possible. Then we can worry about coming up with the grandiose theories that will explain the meaning of culture in the world in later times. So thus you have these two major schools that I was mentioning. You also have the Malinowski school of functionalism, which was more a form of psychological functionalism. It was dealing with the issues of, if I am going to take my boat out out into the ocean where I credibly might die, then I will need something to calm my nerves, and what might be used will be forms of ritual in order to give me some form of larger spiritual force protection to make sure that I can survive. So I was looking at a functionalism not from trying to, in terms of the function of, the analogy of an organ within a living body, but rather saying, I have an end goal. I need people to go out into the ocean to trade, to fish, to get resources, but I can't have them paralyzed by fear. So therefore, my culture will come up with ways of helping them to navigate this fear and to deal with it. So that's it is a form of functionalism. It's more, how can I get people to do what I think would be best for the larger society? Then you have, as we review in the chapter, you have the idea of the super-organic, which held that culture existed above the organic and evolved according to its internal laws beyond the control of individual humans. So it's this part of where we participate in a culture where I, as the individual, can't change it directly, but I'm shaped by the culture on top. So this culture can change, but the changes are not necessarily dependent on any particular individual. They'll be changed by almost part of within the logic, within within the culture. It'll be changed through time, but it's not quite as a direct, I'll do something differently today, and all of culture will change. The other theoretical schools, you have structuralism. So I talked about Derrida and post-structuralism. Here we have structuralism, and it comes down to structure. So the main proponent, perhaps the researcher who is tied to structuralism is Claude Lévi-Strauss. He was a French anthropologist. And he was also, like Boas, he was also Jewish. So there is a moment where during World War II, where Claude Lévi-Strauss flees to New York to avoid the dangers of the Nazi regime. So you have a period where some of the leading anthropologists were in New York as World War II was raging. So Claude Lévi-Strauss develops this school of thought that builds upon a principle that's found in linguistics, which is the binary opposite. So when we speak, we can speak of sounds that are binary opposites, in the sense that they are the same, but one relates with the other. So we can take the sound f and v. So f and v is the same sound, but they're in opposition because one is voiced, one is voiceless, one you speak with a puff of air, and one you don't. So the f versus the v. So the v, when I say v, I don't feel anything in front of my hand. If I put my hand and say, that's very good. Whereas if I use a word with f, there will be this out air kind. That is very fast, so you can feel the air. So the v, the f are the same sound, but they're in opposition based on this difference, voiced and voiceless. So what Claude Lévi-Strauss develops is this theory that says we have structures in our mind, and these structures in our mind are used to make sense of the world. And how we'll make sense of the world is by putting things into these categories where we'll use binary opposites to classify them. So thus, what are some, if you think of your life, what are some things that we can come up with these pairs that are in complete opposition to one to the other? Yeah?
I'll describe it. But like in language? Or
Just in life in general.
Night and day.
Exactly, night and day. What else? Yeah?
The weekend versus the work week.
Okay, so the weekend versus the work week. But in certain ways, again, we're starting this binary division we made between work and not work. Or it's almost tied also to the idea in Western society that's very central, the idea of the private versus the public. You have your hand up and back, or?
Oh, sorry, sir.
What are other things? Yeah?
so like sleep or awake?
Sleep or awake. What else?
Dead or alive?
Exactly, that was the thing. Say either dead or alive. What else?
Heads or tails?
Heads or tails, again, making this binary opposite. But things such as sacred or profane. Is it tied to ideas such as spirits or gods, or is it simply based on the day-to-day activity? So the sacred and profane. How about kneading? Even if you like it rare, what do you tend to do to your steak?
Cook it.
Cook it, exactly. So the cooked versus the raw. So all these are ways in which you create a series of binary opposites to thus create these formulations, to create these ways of defining the world, of categorizing the world based on these binary opposites. And we use, if a good example, even though, of course, Linnaeus never presented it as a structuralist theory, how do we traditionally, in the sciences and biology, how do we categorize species?
Like animals or
Exactly. So what's the difference between an animal versus a plant?
stuff with like their cells. So like
Exactly. What will the cells of plants potentially contain?
chlorophyll,
Exactly. Chlorophyll. And what's the role of chlorophyll?
photosynthesis.
Exactly. So chlorophyll, the plants have chlorophyll that can take light and convert it into energy that they can save. Whereas animals don't, of all types, whether it is the slug, whether it is, the one-celled microorganism, whether it is any other type, does not have the chlorophyll. In other words, it has to obtain its energy from something else, and usually the something else is what is produced by the plant. So in other words, I may have the yeast if I'm making mead, I have the sugars, I have the yeast. The yeast is not creating its own energy. But what it's doing, it is consuming the sugar as part of its energy, and it might release as a byproduct alcohol, and at some point it'll release so much alcohol as a byproduct that it will kill itself. But nonetheless, it doesn't have chlorophyll, it's not trapping energy. So thus, simply chlorophyll or no chlorophyll is a way in which we define at least the two main elements, animalia versus the plant kingdoms. And we go down the line. We go down and say, okay, this particular animal, in the case of fish versus others, does it swim? Yes, no. Does it have gills? Yes or no? How does it get oxygen? Is it fresh water? Is it salt water? And so on and so forth. So we come up with an ever increasing diversity or much more specific set of traits to bring it down not only to the species but to the subspecies. So thus we can say, okay, the difference between this subspecies and that subspecies is this handful of traits. Do they have it? Yes or no? Later now, since we use DNA genetics in order to come up with these differences and ask questions, can they meet and reproduce? But at the very core, Linnaeus would have been seen using ideas of Claude Lévi-Strauss is in the structural saying this is a perfect scheme using these binary opposites to come up with a classification system. So that's and this for Lévi-Strauss would have been no different than kinship. And a structural analysis of kinship. And same thing with kinship. How do we define who kinship terms in any society of the world? Yeah?
Our relationship to them, or
Exactly. So the relationship, and also using these binary opposites. No, might be, generally speaking, there might be expressions, or it might be male versus female. Is it a male relative? Is it a female relative? Is it an older relative or a younger relative? Is it on the mother's side or the father's side, etc.? So you would be coming up with much more precise definitions, terms, depending on how you choose these binary opposites, and it's sort of these switches. Yes, no. So yes, they are older. Check. Are they male or female? Female. Check. Are they direct ancestor? Check. So you go down through this, and then you say, okay, mother, and then you can come up with a list of criteria, checking off these binary opposites to say yes, because they have these are being checked on or off. This is how we define this particular individual, and this individual in relation to everybody else has to be understood through this schematic of binary opposites. What we have with the structures is the idea that all humans have these structures in their brains, and these structures that push us to classify and understand our world in specific ways using this concept of these binary opposites. So this was the theory that was being developed to understand, again, to come up with the larger rules governing how we live in society. Ethnoscience is, in many ways, bound to the structuralist point of view. So with ethnoscience, you have individuals going to different cultures and seeing how do they define plant or animals. What are the criteria that they will use to come up with their classification system in which they understand the natural world in which they live. And this isn't necessarily ethnocide, but indirectly it is. Here's an example. So I did a lot of research looking at the fur trade, looking at the populations, let's say French-speaking Métis population of the Great Lakes. And in the Great Lakes, there is the spread of Catholicism. And if we look at Catholicism, what are the expectations for Fridays, but especially the 40 days before Good Friday? What are you not supposed to do in traditional Catholicism the 40 days before Good Friday? Comes down to what are you not supposed to eat? Yes? And definitely meat. Red meat. You can eat fish, but not red meat. But here's a problem. I'm in the lakes, let's say in the Great Lakes region. It's in, let's say, March, perhaps early April, and there isn't a lot of red meat around available. So in terms of my abilities to hunt, fish, produce food, I can't really have I don't have a good source of food. Even my food stores, what the carrots or the potatoes that I had in my garden are starting to end. There isn't much food available, but waters are thawing. And there are all these muskrats running around. And these muskrats, they can be caught quite easily. They're quite tasty. I can cook them. But I'm in the Lenten period, 40 days before the Great Lent, just before Easter, and I can't eat red meat. So if I'm the priest, the missionary there's there, and I don't want my people to suffer too much, what's a way that I can work around the prohibition against eating red meat during the Lenten period when the main food source I have are these muskrats? They don't count. But also, where do muskrats spend a lot of their time? Oh, the muskrat is? So the muskrat is this, it's a rodent. And what you'll have them, I grew up with lots of muskrats when I was young. We had dugouts, I guess, where we actually had so they go in, the muskrats will go in and make burrows. And they will spend time in their burrows. They'll eat, they live around the lakes or the streams or where you have water. They will spend the winters in their burrows. So it's somewhat like a beaver, but it doesn't make the dams. And instead of having that flat tail, it has much more like a rat-like tail. So it's perhaps bigger than your average rat. Thus you have these muskrats, they're coming out, but most of the time they spend a lot of time in the water. Exactly. So you design them saying, for the purposes of Lent, these are fish. So my binary opposite, they are fish. So to summarize it, Gesundheit. So you have other forms. So we see also symbolic anthropology. So this was almost trying to fill the chasm, and we'll talk about Marxist anthropology. The symbolic was the ways in which we use symbols to try to define the world around us. And I'll give you a case. One of the works that I used for my master's thesis, and I still think it's a relative term to this day, is the idea of symbolic competition. This was put forward by Erich Schwimmer in the 1970s in a very wonderful 1972 article in the journal Anthropologica. And where in this particular article, the Schwimmer is looking at the population, indigenous population in southern Alberta, known as, then was the term used was the Blood Indians. And he was trying to understand this population were living surrounded by farmers. So they were living in the region around southern Alberta where you have very large wheat farms. And in other words, have discovered that they were discouraged, and there were many factors that ensured that the Blood would not become successful wheat farmers. Instead, they focused on ranching, on using horses and ranching and other means. And there Schwimmer looks at the question is, how do you come up with a value system? So if we look at our society, what tends to be the value system by which we rank individuals? And we discussed it when we talked about Weber, yes?
How successful they are?
Exactly, successful. And how do we measure success? What? Sorry? Wealth, exactly. Money, wealth. The more money you have, the better you are at the game and the more successful you are. However, when it comes to money and wealth, what are things that will help you or discourage you from establishing money and wealth? Yeah?
Some people's faith.
Sometimes the faith. What else? Let's say if we look at Bill Gates, one of the richest men in this world, he's often presented as the self-made billionaire. But what were the things that helped him along the way to become this self-made billionaire? His mother was a higher-ranking individual within the international business machines. She was part of the upper administration. She was an executive. So therefore, she knew the people, the movers and the shakers and deciders within the international business machine corporation. And thus, when they were trying to come up with ideas, we need certain software if we're going to build these things that we're going to call personal computers. And what do you think Gates' mother helped him do? to make the connections, to say, so she could tell the CEOs and the corporate executives, oh, by the way, my son is working in my basement on this wonderful computer software program that would be exactly what you need for IBM. So what do we have therefore? We have Bill Gates develops the first Microsoft DOS, this operating system that then is implemented, incorporated into these computers that international business machines are making, that will be building. He keeps the copyright saying, yeah, I'll give you you can buy the software from me, but I'm not giving it to you, so we'll have this own little business. And next thing, we have the birth of Microsoft, and billions of dollars later accumulated by Gates. You have the making of Gates, the self-made billionaire. However, what was he truly self-made? He had good connections. Had it not been for those good connections, odds are he may never have succeeded. He may have ended up as your average person living perhaps in the suburbs doing their 9-to-5 job. But it was the connections that made it. So in other words, and even then, this happens at the local level as well. If you are the local rancher, if I want to be a farmer in Canada now, what do I need? What?
You have to come from a farming family.
Farming family. And why do you have to come from a farming family?
You need land.
You need land, exactly. And why? What is it? Why is having a farming family so is essential to becoming a successful farmer in Canada? Yes. You could, and more importantly, your parents have lots of land that they will give to you, or sell to you at a very reasonable rate, or otherwise pass on in your inheritance. So in other words, if you have the ability where you have your parents or your extended family saying, we will co-sign the loans to allow you to buy a few extra quarters of land. We will co-sign the loans to get you to buy the combines and all the other machinery. We will do this in order to ensure that you are successful. We'll lend you our tractors when need be, etc., etc. Your ability to become a farmer or a large-scale farmer is based on your family's accumulated capital and their ability to help you start the business. And that's why I'm teaching you today. Because my parents were very small, not too successful grain farmers in northern Alberta. And I quickly understood that if I were to become a very successful farmer, I simply didn't have the money or the capital to do it. I wasn't necessarily interested to do it either. I understood that being a small farmer in our day and age simply was a step up from living in abject poverty. So thus, I went off to do a bachelor's degree, master's degree, and PhD. Thus, I'm here before you. Whereas a few miles down the road, there was one young fellow who had worked on the rigs, he had a sister, his father, had accumulated a large enough quantity of land. His father had bought all this new equipment, and he had put in all those insurance saying, if I die, then the loan will be paid off. So thus, and he was quite young, so he was very good friends with my father. He was in his late 50s. He passes away. Then all of a sudden, it is the son who takes over the farm, and he has all this very large, expensive new farm machinery that it has been paid off. He has the land to begin with, and thus he has the capital, and he starts farming. He'll eventually pay off his share to his sister, but but with the capital, with this equipment, he can then start buying additional quarter sections of land, and thus grow as a large successful farmer to this day. But nonetheless, so we can see is that it's very difficult without the right connections, whether it's at the high level, the low level, at the town level, at the nation level, at the international level. If you don't have these connections and the ability to find the people with the capital, or to create the capital, or to get the money that you need, your odds of becoming the next Bill Gates are pretty small. And if we look to this day, what is the main difference between you in this class and the student in a Harvard anthropology class? Why are people willing to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to go study anthropology at Harvard? Yeah.
Because it's a very respected school, so students that come from there will be accepted pretty much anywhere.
but more important than that, who are the types of students who will get into Harvard? For connections and?
I was gonna say money.
Hey, lots of money and lots of money. So if your parents can say, I'll build a building on, if you want 100 million to build a building, we will do it. But my son or daughter is not necessarily the brightest bulb on the porch. But do you mind accepting them anyways? So thus, if you are the very bright student who's accepted at Harvard, who are the people that you're going to be seeing every day? Lots of rich people, the sons and daughters and nieces or nephews or others of millionaires and billionaires. And thus, so the real value of the education at Harvard is not what you're learning, but the connections you are to make. So thus, when you graduate, you can call upon, I'll call upon X, whose relative is high up in Google, and I'll have them give me the connections, give me a leg up to find my job, or maybe get the money to invest in my startup, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So coming back to the symbolic competition. So that's, if we're living in a society, so the Euro-Canadian farmers living around, around this reservation, had the leg up in that they had, whether it's a family connection, the ability to go into bank to get funding to buy equipment, all these other things that helped them to achieve this material success. So they had the leg up that the indigenous populations did not have. So therefore, if you're in a system where you have this value ranking system, makes it difficult for you or nearly impossible for you to reach that top scale, what is the only real avenue open to you? And where Schwimmer argues is that what they did is as you have the turning around. If your value system says that you are successful if you have lots and lots of wealth, you may invert it and say, no, but that doesn't mean you're successful. It means you're also greedy. You have all of these negative attributes. You may be greedy and have this wealth, but I am generous. I am more, so I have these other traits. You create an inversion. You create a value system that you can be successful at, that fits into perhaps your model, into your structure. And what Schwimmer is saying, things such as giving somebody, in a sense, in your community, the use of your horse for free, was a recent innovation. Since in the past, people used to ask perhaps for something in exchange for using their horses, even if they were in the same, within the same nation, indigenous nation. But it was part of this way, in a sense, where you create the structure of symbolic competition to create a value system that you can actually be successful at. Thus, it's the ways in which, the symbolic is part of our way of organizing ourselves, of finding value in ourselves, finding value within our system, and it's built into our understanding of the world. So the symbolic anthropology was one of the theoretical, perhaps, schools that what came out was quite relatively strong in the 1970s. But you have the structuralists, which are quite strong, especially in parts of Europe and in Canada. But the other really strong, especially in Europe, was the Marxist theory. And as I was mentioning, in Marxism, what do we see as the final end goal of humanity? Communism, exactly. So you want to reach communism. But you also look at how does Marx explain history and human change? It's all the material. It's all about the money and capital. So that's what he says, that society is always there's always class conflict. There are different sectors of society who have different privileges, different means of ways of attaining and achieving power and maintaining power. And these different classes in society will often be in conflict unless they are controlled. So he was looking specifically at the transition from a feudal society to a capitalist society. So how did he understand feudal society? Who are the leaders in feudal society? Yep.
Lords of the land or the king?
Exactly. The kings, the tsars, the emperors. You have all these individuals who have the power. And how did they achieve this power? Yep. It's hereditary, but in terms of heredity, how did the first person of their bloodline get this power? Let's take case, no, we have the English William the Conqueror. Whom did William the Conqueror conquer? The English, because he was a Normand. He was from France, he was the Duke of Normandy. And who were the Normans? They were Vikings. They were Vikings. You have Rollo, the Viking, who at some point the king of France says, you know what, you keep attacking us, I'll make a deal with you, Rollo. I'll give you these lands, you can be a duke, your family can have this power, but you'll still swear an oath to me. But you will have this authority, this responsibility, and those peasants, the people who are living here, you can have them as your peasants. So thus you create a system, whereas Rollo, because he was the leader of the Vikings that kept attacking the leadership of Paris of France, they made a deal, said, we will give you hereditary power over these lands in order for your descendants to have, this duchy of Normandy. And over a few generations later, you have these Vikings largely assimilated. So they adopted the language of the period, so let's say a form of Old to Middle French. But because they were Vikings, there are certain sounds that they could not pronounce very well. And one of them was the G sound. In words such as Guillaume and Gare and Guerrier, instead they pronounced it more as a W sound. So Guillaume became William, Guerrier became Moirier, Gare became Moire. And so for example, Gare is a French word for war. So thus, have Gare, because the Anglo-Normans couldn't necessarily pronounce the G properly, they were pronouncing more as War, and thus it became in English what? War. Guerrier, Warrier, warrior. And so you have all these words, and William became William. So you have these transitions. But we have William the Conqueror, from this ancestral Viking, establishes the Duchy of Normandy, who has these ancestral powers. There's the lands of the Angles and the Saxons and others. And what does William the Conqueror do then? He puts his people and relatives in positions of power. So he recreates it, saying, instead of these Angles and these Saxons and especially these others who are living here, they won't be the royalty and the nobility anymore. I will put my people, my relatives, my friends so here is my friend who came with me. He'll be the Duke of X. He will be the Duke of this other region. So he establishes this framework where you have all of a sudden this Norman Duke, from Normandy in France, becomes the king, who then establishes all his infrastructure in what would become England, and eventually England and Scotland and Wales and all these other periods. So he creates, so it was part of the warrior. The reason why he was able to do this, he won the Battle of Hastings. His forces were able to defeat the kings of England. He was able to physically take over the power. He had the military power to take over the lands, distribute it to his allies, to his friends, to his relatives, and establish this leadership that would rule over England and Great Britain to this day. Because if you look 1,000 years later, the descendants of the Normans are still in the higher classes of England. So in other words, their inheritance is still there. No, their descendants, the dukes, etc., are still there. They established themselves. So thus, but it's the logic. So thus, in the feudal period, so coming back to Marx, you have these military powers that established power, and they held their power based on their control of force. And they had these people who were working the lands, who were tilling the lands, and if these peasants decide to rise up, what would you do?
Use your military power.
Exactly. You would kill them. Usually in very gruesome, grotesque ways, in order to send a message saying, if you think about doing it again, this is what is going to happen to you. So thus in the feudal society, you have this elite, the nobility that holds the military and economic power. You have the peasantry who are there tilling the land, and part of what they will produce every year is given to to this nobility, to the landed gentry, nobility, etc. What are the other elements of society in, let's say, in feudal England? What are other sectors of society? Yeah?
The working class?
Okay, but the working class didn't exist yet because the people who were working were either the peasants Or they were the ones who had, usually the ones producing certain things, the ones making copper tools, the one making barrels, the ones who had these guilds. And working largely it's the peasants, but you do have some specialized workers in very specific fields producing certain goods that are part of these guilds, and they usually live in the towns. So that is essential, but they're not workers per se. They're not working to get paid by their own factory owners, but they're working to sell their goods in order to get the funds that they need to continue to buy what they need to survive. So you have these various, I guess, guilds and merchants. Who else do you have? Yep.
With priests being.
Exactly. You have the priests and you have the monks. You have the monasteries. And the monastery, you have the lands, I guess, the lands of the church held in England were quite massive. You have monasteries. They grow their own, they have their sheep, they grow their foods, they're brewing beer, they're doing these other things. But how would Marx understand the role of the church in feudal England? What does the priest want you to do? Yeah?
Remain complacent.
Exactly. The priest wants you must pay your tithe, the 10% of whatever you're producing. And you also must follow the rules of the church. So thus the church is saying, your goal, and this is the French Canadian is saying, on est pour un petit pain. You may be poor, but if you're poor and you live your life according to the doctrine of God, then where will you end up? In heaven, exactly. So it's also a form of control, spiritual control, which is to say, no, you shouldn't rise up against the monarch. They were elected. They were chosen by God. You must remain faithful. You must strive for your heaven afterwards. So just continue plowing your fields and doing what you do or making your pots. Don't think about changing the power. That's not God's will. So thus this is why Marx looking at the church as the opiate of the masses. In other words, keeping them under control spiritually so they don't try to rise up and but they're not, every so often you do have peasant uprisings, every so often you have conflicts, etc. But for the most part, you have the nobility controlling the lands. And how do you get more power as a noble?
Get more land.
And how do you get more land as a noble? You can get two ways, exactly. Either military force, you conquer it, or you marry into it. And this is why if you look at the feudal England, very often you might be the king of France and send your daughter off to Russia to marry the son of the Tsar. So you create these family alliances where therefore you can start adding. So you become the king of X, the duke of Y, the prince of Z, and so on and so forth, because you're piecing all these bits of land in the sense that you have acquired through conquest or through marriage or through inheritance in order to keep control. So that's the conflict. The two classes in conflict are largely the peasantry and the nobility, with the priests in the middle, along with the merchants, etc., playing their role in keeping the peasantry under the foot of the nobility. But then you have, Marx says this is what he would be looking at, the rise of capitalism. So all of a sudden, what makes money during this industrial capital development in Europe? Is it the farmers raising, their sheep and and having their wheat fields in your lands? Not really. Because what makes the money is the factory with the workers transforming goods to making the wool socks that you can try to export, making these other goods. So thus all of a sudden wealth is acquired not based on how much land you have, but based on how many factories you have and how many workers you have who are doing the jobs to make you more capital. And if you're successful, your factory makes money, you buy more factories, you establish more factories, you get more workers, and so on and so on. But this, from Marx, will put you in conflict with whom? The nobility, who have the power, and they have the land, they have their peasants that you want as workers, so that you put them, who will have the ultimate political control? All of a sudden, you have the rising bourgeoisie, you have the old nobility. The nobility might try to recycle themselves, maybe try to get into the business, but for the most part, all of a sudden, who is it the one that now controls the main source of wealth? It's no longer the nobility. But it's not even the workers, but it's the bourgeoisie. The people who have the capital, who own the factories, who own the means and the modes of productions. So now it's the people who own the factories, who own they're the bourgeoisie, the ones who are now the economic top, but they don't have, they have the economic power, but they don't have the political power. So what do? Roll out the guillotine. In other words, Marx will say the French Revolution, the guillotining of the nobility, the kings, etc., was a way for the bourgeoisie to say enough of this nobility. We are the ones who are in power now. We are the ones who will decide. And this is what Marx will call the rise of the bourgeois nation state. So you change the politics to align. So the people who will have the financial capital will also make sure that they control the politics as well. So thus Marx is looking at these class conflicts and how the changing in terms of the major driving force, the means and the modes of production, who controls the wealth, as being essential in the making of power. But how could we apply these ideas to anthropologists doing their field work? Again, means and modes of production, and power, and economic power. So thus, if I am Michael Ash studying working with the Dene in Canada, how am I going to be using somewhat of a Marxist perspective to understand what is going on? It comes back, who controls the wealth? Who owns the capital? Who are the people, the movers and the shakers? And how do the indigenous populations fit into this? The treaty-making process, how was it fit into this? So why do you have the negotiation of treaties? Because you want the land. And why do you want the land? To bring the settlers in who will be farming the land. And why do the leading families in Canada in the 1800s and early 1900s, why do they want these people farming the lands? Exactly, because what will all these homesteaders in Alberta, Saskatchewan, BC, etc., what will they have to buy to grow their wheat? They'll need plows, they'll need axes, they'll need all these goods, and who are the people producing and selling these goods? The rich industrial families out in southern Ontario, maybe Montreal. So that's how Michael Ash should be looking at these changes, will be looking from these economic forces, these economic pressures, the ways in which these are shaping the politics, and how the politics are being shaped, guided by specific economic goals as the nation state seeks to gain certain economic forces and powers within the larger global era. So that you'll have these anthropologists will be trying to understand how we fit into, how these continuing class conflicts, how these continuing issues of capital, how they have direct effects on the lives of individuals everywhere in society, including the indigenous population. So very often you have the Marxism in direct competition with the structuralism. Eventually, both are abandoned, but very often with Marxism, especially in the United States in the 1950s, you have McCarthyism, you have this fear of the communists, of the Soviets, of the Chinese. So you would rebrand it. You would call it political economy. Or in the case of, you have ecological, you have the case of, I guess in the case where you have cultural materialism. So with Marvin Harris, he's trying to explain things. Why is the cow sacred in India? And why is the cow seen as sacred? In India, it's because it's a sacred, it's part of the worldview, it's a religious value, so it is a religious understanding of the cow is sacred. But Marvin Harris said, no, the reason why the cow is sacred has nothing to do with religion. Really, religion was a justification to make sure that nobody would think about eating a hamburger. Because the cow was a useful animal in India. In other words, what are some of the things that cows produce that aren't meat? Milk? What else? What? More cows. And also a lot of dung. So as they eat and poop, their poop is useful for many ways. It can be collected, it can be tried, it can be burnt. And if you want to have a nice, good steak, what do you have to do with your cow or calf that becomes a steer? Needs a lot of feed, lots of either good pasture, or lots of barley or oats, etc. But this, if you're going to have the nice fat piece of steak, you need to devote a lot of resources, water and food and land to get that. But if my goal is not to have the dung, to have perhaps some milk, perhaps eventually you'll have the untouchables, the dialysts, you will be taking the hide off of the dead cow to make leather. Is it necessary for me to have the cow nice and fat? No. So the idea of material is saying, in a sense, you have a society where they need the cattle, and the cattle roam around almost eating, I guess, nothing else wants to eat, sort of the bad eating, sort of the eating scraps of whatever they can find, the plants, trees, etc., that are almost the pests for the farmers. So they eat enough to survive, not enough to make a good steak, but they're useful because they produce these things that you need. But it would be very detrimental to India to all of a sudden say we want to become all ranchers and farmers, because that would have negatives. So with the cultural materialists say, yes, they'll put it forward as religion, but there's a material, economic reason why it was so important for them not to eat the cows but still have the cows, so thus they put it into their larger worldview. So this cultural materialist was trying to use economic or material explanations to explain the bigger things such as religion. You have ecological anthropology. It's a reworking of evolutionary thought. So it becomes a multilineal evolution, where to say, no, all societies need energy. You have to transform energy. And thus, the more energy you can capture and you can transform, this will shape what is capable. So that's, at the very beginning, you have hunting and foraging and fishing. But this only produces a certain set amount of calories. I can only have calories, in a sense, from the food I can gather, hunt, etc. But so there means I can only do so many things. My population can only reach certain levels. If I have too many people, there won't be enough food. So thus I have to keep my population relatively small, relatively generally dispersed, in order to ensure that we can have the good life. But all of a sudden, the next stage we have domestication. And we have domestication of plants, and we have animals. And once I have cattle, what else do I have? I have oxen. And another reason why you want cattle in India, what do the oxen do?
They plow.
Exactly. They're usually the males, sometimes the castrated males that grow quite large, they're used to plow, along with the horses. So they provide more power, the ability, more energy that you can use in your day-to-day life. So therefore, since you have more energy, food calories, which means then you have more of this the horse and cow power. And thus, what does that allow me to do? Have larger populations, maybe build bigger buildings, have larger cities, etc. So this school of thought, Julian Stewart and Leslie Wise, again, are counting the energy and saying the more energy I have to spend, the more they can do with that energy, and and the next stage would be industrialization, the use all of a sudden of coal, of oil and gas to start producing more and more energy. And the next step after this industrial life based on hydrocarbons, what comes next? Nuclear. So that's the goal, the dream being to have all of a sudden you can get rid of the hydrocarbons and replace it with either nuclear fission or fusion, or now increasingly we're also turning it to other forms, wind, solar, etc. But again, it comes down to the thing is we need all this energy to maintain our societies, post-industrial societies. If we're not going to get it from hydrocarbons, we have to get it from elsewhere. And what happens if I don't want or don't have the hydrocarbons to burn and I can't replace the energy? Things will collapse. Because all of a sudden, if I have this farm, let's say I own this farm that has 50 quarter sections, it's myself with maybe a few workers farming it. What happens if all of a sudden I don't have the diesel for the tractors? Or the diesel for the combines?
Then you can't produce as much energy as you were before.
But not only the energy, but also all of a sudden I can't plant my fields. I can't harvest my fields. So what does that mean?
No money.
No money. And also, who needs the wheat that's being grown and sold?
People.
Everybody else. So these billions of people, in a sense, who are reliant on the ability to produce large quantities of food using this energy, all of a sudden they'll go to their store and say, I don't have any spaghetti that I can buy, and I don't have the bread I can buy, because all of a sudden the wheat isn't sent to the mills, it isn't sent to the bakeries, isn't sent to the store, and all of a sudden all these people who rely on the ability to have this excess energy, creating excess food that they rely to eat, whether it be the wheat or the rice or whatever else you may be eating, all of a sudden that disappears. And thus, from a South perspective, that means if you don't have the energy for the tractors and the combines and the cars and the tanks, etc., you have these 6 to 8 billion people that you can't necessarily produce enough food to feed all of them, and to try to come back to some kind of hunter-gathering feudal society will mean that you'll have to get rid of at least 90% of your population. In other words, the existing population can only be maintained if you can produce enough food to feed those 6, 7, or 8 billion people. And if you don't, that means people will die. So that's, again, so this multilineal evolution. So yes, this energy allows us to do different things, but if you don't have that energy, something will have to break. So again, it was looking at cultural change, and based on the ability to harness energy from different sources to be able to produce what you need to produce for your society to survive. And finally, the political ecology and the ontological turn. So this is where it comes back to Foucault and comes back to Derrida, where you start asking the question, what is really real? What is the real? What are facts? When you start questioning the foundations of this very scientific, the positivist point of view, saying, if I can find enough facts, I can understand what's happening in the world. So in a nutshell, that is chapter 2.